Pack your tools and get off my sight. You're done." The words cut across the scaffold deck like a blade, loud enough for every man within 30 feet to stop what he was doing. Garrett Pullen didn't lower his voice. He never did. That was the point. The volume wasn't about communication. It was about territory. The man he was firing didn't flinch. He bent down, picked up his thermos from the planking where he'd set it, and screwed the cap back on slowly. Around him, 30 workers stood frozen mid-motion, tools in hand, eyes moving between Pullen's red face and the laborer's steady one. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. Because this story isn't really about a construction site. It's about what happens when the wrong man gets silenced, and what comes back with him when the truth refuses to stay buried. Desmond Hale had been awake since 5. Not the restless kind of awake that comes from worry, though he had plenty to worry about. This was the practiced, functional wakefulness of a man who had structured his mornings around someone else's needs for so long that his body had simply accepted it as the new order of things. The alarm was set for 5:15. He was always up before it. The apartment was small, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen where the window faced the wall of the building next door. It wasn't much to look at, but it was clean in a way that required daily intention, not luck. Dishes stacked properly. Shoes paired at the door. A weekly whiteboard calendar on the fridge with Marcus's schedule written in blue marker and Desmond's shifts written in black. He made the lunches first. That was the rule he'd set for himself in the early months after Alina died, when the mornings had been so heavy he'd had to break them into tasks small enough to actually complete. Make lunches. Then the coffee. Then wake Marcus, one thing at a time until the world felt navigable again. Marcus emerged from his room at 6:20, with his hair pressed flat on one side and his backpack already on, which meant he'd slept in it again. Desmond didn't comment. He handed him a glass of orange juice and watched him drink it standing at the counter, still half asleep, and felt the quiet, specific gratitude of a man who knows exactly what he would lose if he lost this. The school drop-off was its own small ritual. The crossing guard, a retired postal worker named Gerald, always had something to say about the weather. This morning he said it looked like rain by noon. Desmond said he'd believe it when he saw it. Marcus waved without turning around and disappeared through the school doors. The site bus came at 7:10 from the corner of Meridian and 4th. Desmond was already at the stop when the younger laborers arrived, most of them with coffee cups and phones. A man named Richie, 23, new to the crew, complained about Pullen before the bus had even pulled away from the curb. Something about last Friday's overtime being miscoded on the payroll sheet. Desmond listened. He had a habit of listening more than he spoke, which some people read as shyness and others read as indifference. It was neither. It was the trained patience of someone who had spent years in rooms where the wrong word at the wrong moment could cost a project its timeline or a building its integrity. He'd learned to let information settle before he responded to it. He had a folded spec sheet in the inside pocket of his vest. He'd printed it at home before leaving, the section on scaffold load tolerances highlighted in yellow. He'd done that before the first sign of any problem, not because he suspected one yet, but because he always reviewed the current phase specs before a poor day. Old habit. The kind that doesn't fully leave a man no matter how much distance he puts between himself and his former life. The tower came into view as the bus crossed the waterfront bridge, 42 floors in progress, steel and glass, and the pale blue sheeting of weather protection on the upper levels. It was an impressive structure in the way that large things are impressive before you know whether they were built correctly. Desmond looked at the 14th floor framing as they passed, eyes moving with the automatic precision of someone who was not just looking at a building, but reading it. Something in his jaw tightened. He didn't say anything. He folded the spec sheet back into his pocket and watched the tower disappear behind the bridge support as the bus turned toward the site entrance. The site smelled the way it always did at 7:30, diesel exhaust, wet concrete, and the particular metallic tang of steel that had been sitting in cold air overnight. Desmond stepped off the bus and moved through the equipment yard with the unhurried efficiency of a man who knew exactly where he was going and had no interest in announcing it. The 14th floor was accessible by the external hoist, a rattling cage that carried men and materials up the face of the building in 40-second intervals. Desmond rode it with Theo Briggs and 2 younger laborers whose names he was still learning. Theo was 51, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had stopped being surprised by things a long time ago. He'd been on construction sites for 28 years. He could read a foreman's mood from across a floor and a structural problem from across a room. The hoist opened onto the 14th floor deck, and the morning hit them full. Wind off the waterfront. The city spread out below in the early gray light, the skeleton of the upper floors rising above them like something not yet decided. Desmond walked to the primary scaffold junction at the north wall without stopping to set his gear down first. He crouched. The bracket assembly was a standard crossing bearer configuration, the kind used on poor decks to distribute the weight of wet concrete across the temporary support structure below. He'd looked at hundreds of them over the years, thousands if he was being honest, and the visual language of a correct assembly was as familiar to him as the layout of his own kitchen. These pins were wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not the kind of wrong that an untrained eye would catch, or even that a trained eye would catch on a quick walkthrough. The substitution was subtle. The load pins securing the primary junction were a standard diameter rather than the heavy gauge specification required for a pour deck at this height and span. Visually similar, functionally compromised. The difference between them was 4 millimeters, and under a full concrete load, potentially everything. He took his phone out and photographed the bracket from 3 angles. Then he unfolded the spec sheet from his vest pocket and confirmed the pin diameter requirement against what he was looking at. He already knew what he'd find. He confirmed it anyway. "You're looking at the junction," Theo said from behind him. Not a question. Desmond stood and turned. Theo was looking at the bracket with the same quiet attention, arms crossed, expression settled somewhere between concern and resignation. "The pins are undersized," Desmond said. 4 millimeters under spec for a poor deck load at this span. Whoever swapped them out either didn't check the schedule or didn't care. Theo was quiet for a moment. He looked at the bracket, then at the concrete truck booking whiteboard mounted on the far wall of the deck. The pour was listed for 6 am the following morning. "That's tomorrow," Theo said. "I know. You going to take it to Pullen?" Desmond slid the phone back into his pocket. He looked at the bracket one more time, not because he needed to look again, but because he wanted to be certain. Certainty was the only thing worth carrying into a conversation with a man like Pullen. "Yes," he said. Theo exhaled through his nose. He fired Danny Marsh 2 weeks ago for flagging a rebar spacing issue on 9. Said Danny was manufacturing complaints to get out of hard work. He paused. Danny had a family. "So do I," Desmond said. He picked up his gear bag and walked toward the hoist. If you've ever been in a room where you knew the right answer and watched someone with a title pretend you didn't, stay with this story. Subscribe and hit the bell, because what happens next is the reason we tell stories like this one. Pullen's site office was a double-wide trailer parked at the southeastern corner of the equipment yard, positioned so that the foreman could see the main site entrance from his desk. Desmond had been inside it twice before, once during the initial site induction, once to sign a revised shift agreement. Both times Pullen had been on the phone and had gestured for him to sit without looking up. Both times, Desmond had stood instead. He knocked on the trailer door at 8:15 and didn't wait for an answer before opening it. Pullen was at his desk, a paper coffee cup at his elbow, and a site schedule spread across the surface in front of him. He looked up with the flat expression of a man interrupted during something he considered more important than whatever was coming through his door. "Hale," he said. "What?" Desmond stepped inside and placed his phone on the desk, the photograph of the bracket facing up. "The north junction pins on 14 are undersized," he said. "The pour is scheduled for 6 a.m. tomorrow. It needs to be corrected before the truck arrives." Pullen looked at the photograph. Then he looked at Desmond. Pullen picked up the phone with 2 fingers like he was handling something mildly unpleasant. He looked at the photograph for approximately 4 seconds. Then he set it back down on the desk and leaned back in his chair. "You're a laborer," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a classification, the kind of thing a man says when he wants to remind you of the distance between where you're sitting and where he's sitting without having to measure it out loud. "I am," Desmond said. "And those pins are still undersized." Pullen reached for his coffee cup and took a slow sip. Outside, the site was fully alive now, the grinding of equipment, the rhythmic percussion of steel on steel, men calling to each other across the floors above. The sounds pressed against the trailer walls and made the silence between the 2 men feel more deliberate than it actually was. "You know what I see when I look at that photo?" Pullen said. He turned the phone screen toward Desmond as if presenting evidence. "I see a bracket. I see pins. I see a junction that my crew assembled and my crew signed off on. You know what I don't see?" Desmond waited. "A problem," Pullen said. "The diameter on those pins is 4 millimeters under the heavy gauge specification for a pour deck at that span," Desmond said. "At full concrete load, the shear stress on that junction will exceed the rated tolerance by somewhere between 18 and 22%. That's not a margin. That's a failure point." Something shifted in Pullen's face, not quite a reaction, more the suppression of one. A brief tightening around the eyes that a less attentive man would have missed entirely. He'd understood enough of what Desmond said to know it sounded credible, and that bothered him more than if it had sounded ignorant. "Where'd you pick that up?" he said. "YouTube?" "The Federal Construction Safety Code," Desmond said. "Appendix 7C scaffold loading specifications for elevated pour decks. It's in the site compliance binder on your shelf." Pullen didn't look at the shelf. "I've got a developer breathing down my neck for a delivery date," he said, and his voice had changed now, not louder, but flatter, stripped of the performance quality it had carried a moment ago. This was the real voice, the one that lived underneath the authority. "I've got a concrete truck booked. I've got 40 men whose schedules are built around a 6 pour. I am not halting this project because a laborer looked at a bracket and got nervous." "I'm not nervous," Desmond said. "I'm telling you there's a structural defect in the scaffold deck that will be carrying a full concrete load in less than 22 hours. That's not anxiety. That's a fact." Pullen stood up. He wasn't a small man. He used his size the way some men use silence, as a form of pressure, a physical renegotiation of who owned the room. He came around the desk and stopped a few feet from Desmond, arms crossed, and looked at him with the expression of someone who had shut down this kind of conversation many times before, and found it easier each time. "You want to tell me how to run my site," he said. "That it? I want the pins replaced before the pour. And I want a project that comes in on schedule and doesn't cost the developer another week of penalties." Pullen's voice was rising now, not into shouting, but into that particular register of controlled aggression that men in authority use when they want you to feel the edge of what they're capable of without crossing it themselves. You know what slows a site down more than anything? Men who manufacture complaints because they'd rather stand around reading spec sheets than do the work they were hired to do. Desmond looked at him steadily. I'm not manufacturing anything. You're done here, Pullen said. Get back on the floor. I need you to acknowledge the complaint formally. I need you to get back on the floor before I make this a different kind of conversation. The trailer was quiet for a moment. Through the smudged window behind Pullen's desk, the tower rose against the gray morning sky. The 14th floor visible as a thin horizontal line of scaffold planking halfway up the structure. 40 men. A concrete truck. 6 a.m. Desmond picked up his phone from the desk. I'll file it through HR, he said. You do whatever you need to do, Pullen said. He was already turning back toward his desk, already done with the conversation in the way that men with authority end things, not by resolving them, but by withdrawing attention. And Hale? Next time you've got a concern, remember what your job title actually is. Desmond walked out of the trailer without answering. The door swung shut behind him. He stood for a moment in the equipment yard, the cold morning air against his face, and looked up at the 14th floor. Then he walked toward the HR office. Cora Vance's office was a single wide trailer parked beside the equipment storage shed, smaller than Pullen's and considerably more organized. She had a filing system that actually worked, a desktop computer that wasn't buried under paper, and a laminated site compliance checklist mounted on the wall beside her monitor that she updated every Monday morning without being asked. She was thorough in the way that people become thorough when they've spent years cleaning up after men who weren't. Desmond knocked, and she waved him in without looking up from her keyboard. Hale, she said, pulling his name from memory without checking a roster. She had that kind of mind, detail-retentive, quietly efficient. Shift issue? Safety complaint, he said. I need it formally logged. She looked up then. Her expression didn't change dramatically, but something in it recalibrated, the way a careful person looks when they recognize that a conversation is about to require them to be more careful than usual. Sit down, she said. He sat. He walked her through it the same way he'd walked Pullen through it, but without the photographs this time. He described the bracket, the pin diameter, the spec requirement, the pour schedule. He used plain language, not because he was simplifying, but because plain language was harder to dismiss than technical language when written into a formal record. He'd learned that a long time ago in a different life. Cora typed as he spoke. She asked 2 clarifying questions, the exact floor level and the scheduled pour time, and typed those too. When he finished, she read the entry back to him from her screen without being asked, which told him something about her. You've already spoken to Pullen, she said. It wasn't a question either. 8:15 this morning, Desmond said. He declined to act on it. She nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're processing something they already half expected to hear. She printed the complaint form, signed it, date-stamped it, and handed him the carbon copy. I have to be straight with you, she said, and her voice had dropped slightly, not to a whisper, but to the register people use when they want a wall to hear less. My authority here is to record. The decision chain goes through the foreman and up to the project manager. I can't compel a halt. I know, Desmond said. I just needed it on record. She held his gaze for a moment. Is it bad? The defect. Yes, he said simply. He folded his copy of the complaint form and tucked it into his vest pocket beside the spec sheet. He thanked her. He left. He was back on the 14th floor by 9:40, working the eastern deck section with Theo and a laborer named Curtis, who talked constantly and meant nothing by it. The morning moved the way site mornings do, in increments of physical effort, punctuated by equipment noise and the distant sound of the city doing its own work far below. At 2:15, Pullen appeared on the floor. He didn't come to inspect anything. He didn't look at the scaffold junction. He walked to the center of the deck with the deliberate stride of a man who had already decided what he was going to do and wanted an audience for it, and the floor gave him one, because 30 men don't stop noticing when the foreman walks in like that. "Hail," he said. Desmond set down the connector bracket he'd been positioning and stood. "HR just flagged me a complaint form with your name on it," Pullen said. His voice was carrying, and he knew it. He'd pitched it to Carrie. "You want to tell these men what you filed?" The floor had gone quiet in that particular way that large open spaces go quiet when something personal becomes public. Not silence exactly, but a withdrawal of ambient noise, as if the site itself was paying attention. "A scaffold safety concern," Desmond said. "Same thing I told you this morning. What you told me," Pullen said, "was a story. What you filed was a formal complaint that puts my project, my timeline, and 40 men's schedules at risk because you read something on a spec sheet and decided you knew better than the crew that built this deck." "The pins are undersized," Desmond said. "That hasn't changed." "What's changed?" Pullen said, and his voice had dropped now into something quieter and more dangerous, "is that I've got a troublemaker on my floor who doesn't know the difference between doing his job and trying to do mine." He paused. "Let it sit. You're terminated, Hale. Effective right now. Collect your gear and hand your badge to Cora on the way out." Nobody moved. 30 men stood exactly where they were, tools at their sides, watching. Desmond looked at Pullen for a long moment. Then he looked at the North Junction bracket one final time. The real reason for all of it. The thing that would still be wrong tomorrow morning at 6 regardless of what happened to him today. He picked up his thermos. He nodded once to Theo. And he walked to the hoist without a word. The hoist descended in its usual rattling 40 seconds. And for those 40 seconds, Desmond was alone in the cage with the tower sliding upward past him and the ground rising to meet him, and the particular quality of silence that exists inside loud mechanical things. He watched the floors pass, 13, 12, 11, and felt the complaint form folded in his vest pocket pressing against his ribs like something with weight beyond paper. He handed his badge to Cora at the HR trailer. She took it without the practiced neutrality she might have used for a routine departure. Her eyes stayed on his face a moment longer than the transaction required. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Keep that form exactly where it is," he said. "Just that." Then he picked up his gear bag from the equipment locker, walked through the site gate, and stood on the public sidewalk outside the chain-link perimeter with the tower behind him and the waterfront street in front of him and the rest of the afternoon suddenly, completely open. He didn't call anyone. He didn't sit down on the curb and put his head in his hands. He walked 3 blocks to where the site bus stopped in reverse, the pickup point that became the drop-off, and sat on the bench and watched traffic move through the waterfront district while he waited for the city bus that would take him to Marcus's school. Marcus came through the school doors at 3:20 with a drawing rolled up under his arm and paint on his left sleeve that Desmond was fairly certain wasn't coming out. He looked up and found his father on the bench across the street, and his face did the thing it always did. That uncomplicated, unlayered brightness that Desmond had come to think of as the only truly honest emotional response he encountered in any given day. "You're early," Marcus said. "Little bit," Desmond said. They went to the diner on Clement Street, a corner place with vinyl booths and a laminated menu that hadn't changed in 11 years, and a counterwoman named Bess, who always brought Marcus a hot chocolate without being asked. Marcus spread his homework across the table, and Desmond ordered coffee and sat across from his son in the yellow warmth of the diner while the afternoon light went flat outside the window. And somewhere between Marcus's long division and Desmond's second cup of coffee, he made a decision. He took out his phone and scrolled to a contact he hadn't called in 14 months. The name read simply, V. Okafor. He looked at it for a moment. Then he pressed call. It rang twice. If you're still here at this point in the story, you already know this isn't just about a construction site. Subscribe and hit the bell, because the moment that changes everything is coming, and you don't want to find it in someone else's comment. Desmond. Vivienne Okafor's voice was immediate, alert. She was one of those people who answered the phone as if they'd been expecting it. She was a structural compliance consultant now, working out of the regional office of the National Infrastructure Board. They'd worked together for 6 years before Desmond had stepped away from everything. She had never fully accepted his explanation for leaving. It's been a while. It has, he said. I need to tell you something, and I need you to decide what to do with it. I'm not asking you to act. I'm telling you because it needs to be told. A brief pause. Go ahead. He described the bracket. He gave her the pin specifications, the required load gauge, the actual gauge, the pour deck dimensions, the scheduled pour time. He described the floor level, the waterfront tower project, the developer's name. He spoke in the clipped, precise shorthand of two people who had spent years in the same technical language, the kind of conversation where a 4mm figure carries the weight of a paragraph. When he finished, the line was quiet for 3 full seconds. You filed a formal complaint? Vivienne said. Through Site HR at 9:50 this morning. Time-stamped, and they fired you. 2:15 this afternoon. Another silence. Longer this time. He could hear her thinking in the particular way that careful people think. Not rushing. Not reacting. Assembling. Desmond, she said. You know I'm going to have to pass this up the chain. I know, he said. That's going to trigger an audit referral. I know that too. You could have just called it in anonymously, she said, and there was something in her voice that wasn't quite frustration, more like the particular tiredness of someone watching a person they respect make the harder choice when the easier one was right there. I could have, he agreed. She exhaled. Give Marcus my love. He almost smiled. I will. He ended the call and set the phone face down on the table. Across from him, Marcus had abandoned long division in favor of drawing something on the back of his homework sheet. A building, tall and detailed, with careful windows and what appeared to be a flag on top. Desmond looked at it for a moment. Then, he picked up his coffee and drank it while it was still warm. The rain Gerald had predicted arrived at 11 that night. Not dramatic, just persistent. The kind that settles in and intends to stay. Desmond lay awake listening to it against the window while Marcus slept in the next room, and he thought about the bracket the way he always thought about structural problems, not with anxiety, but with the precise, almost involuntary clarity of a mind that had been trained to hold load. Calculations the way other minds hold song lyrics. The numbers were there whether he wanted them or not. 18 to 22% over tolerance. A 6M pour. 40 men. He was up at 5 regardless. He made the lunches. Then the coffee. Then he sat at the kitchen table in the quiet apartment and watched the rain streak the window and thought about nothing in particular, which was the closest he ever got to peace anymore. He walked Marcus to school himself that morning. No sight bus to catch, nowhere to be. Marcus noticed the difference in the walk, the absence of the usual endpoint urgency, and asked 3 questions in rapid succession. Why wasn't Dad going to work? Was Dad in trouble? And could they get waffles on the weekend? Desmond answered the 3rd question first, and the other 2 not at all, which Marcus accepted with the flexible logic of a child who has learned that some adult silences are load-bearing. By 8:30 Desmond was back in the apartment, coffee cooling on the table beside him when his phone buzzed. An unknown number. Regional prefix he recognized. He answered. Mr. Hale. The voice was measured, professional, unhurried. My name is Raymond Osai. I'm a structural safety inspector with the Regional Construction Compliance Office. I've been assigned an audit referral for the Waterfront Tower project on Meridian, the Caldwell Group development. I understand you filed a formal safety complaint with Site HR yesterday morning. That's correct, Desmond said. I'll be conducting an on-site inspection this morning. I have your complaint on file as supporting documentation. A brief pause. I may need to reach you for technical clarification once I've examined the site. Are you available? Yes, Desmond said. Thank you, Mr. Hale. The call ended. Desmond set the phone down on the table and looked at the rain against the window for a moment. Then, he picked up his coffee and finished it. Raymond Osei arrived at the Caldwell Group Tower site at 9:15 with a government-issue clipboard, a camera bag, and the particular unhurried authority of a man who understood that his presence alone was already changing the pressure in every room he hadn't entered yet. He signed in at the site gate, declined Pullen's offer of a site escort, and began at the ground floor. Pullen followed him anyway, maintaining a careful half-step behind, close enough to seem cooperative, far enough to seem unconcerned. He talked through the lower floors with the practiced fluency of someone who had hosted inspections before and knew which details to foreground and which to let recede. Compliance binders, inspection logs, material certifications. Osei listened, looked, photographed, and said very little. By the time they reached the 14th floor via the hoist, the morning crew had been working for 2 hours. The concrete truck was booked for 6 the following morning, the delay caused by a minor equipment issue that had pushed the schedule by exactly 1 day. Pullen mentioned this casually. Osei didn't respond to it. He walked directly to the North Junction bracket. He crouched in the same position Desmond had crouched in 2 mornings ago, and he looked at the same assembly with the same quality of focused attention. He took 3 photographs. He produced a measuring tool from his bag and checked the pin diameter against a reference card he kept in his breast pocket. He straightened up. Who flagged this section in the complaint log? He said without turning around. Pullen's voice came from behind him, slightly tighter than it had been. One of the laborers. Filed it through HR. He was. We had to let him go yesterday for unrelated performance issues. Osei turned around. I'll need to see the original complaint form. They rode the hoist back down in silence. In the HR trailer, Cora pulled the form from her file within 45 seconds. She had it at the front, Desmond noticed, as if she'd known someone would ask for it. Osei read it standing at her desk. He read it twice. Then he looked at the name at the bottom of the form. His expression didn't collapse or transform. It was a smaller movement than that, a stillness that arrived in his face, a recalibration so brief and controlled that only someone watching closely would have caught it. He looked at the name the way a person looks at something they recognize in a place they didn't expect to find it. Desmond Hale, he said quietly. Cora said nothing. Pullen shifted his weight. Osei looked up from the form. Is this the Desmond Hale who served as contributing author on the Federal Construction Safety Code? He paused. Appendix 7C specifically. The HR trailer was very quiet. Outside, the rain continued its patient work against the roof. Pullen's response came after a delay that was just long enough to be telling, the half-second gap of a man whose prepared answer doesn't fit the question he actually received. I don't know anything about that, he said. He was a laborer on my crew. Osei looked at him with the calm, unreadable patience of someone who had spent 20 years in rooms where people said things they hoped sounded more convincing than they were. He didn't challenge the statement. He simply turned back to the complaint form in his hand and read it one more time. Then he reached into his camera bag and produced a book. It wasn't large, a standard government issue reference volume, the kind that inspectors carry in the field because the digital version doesn't load reliably on construction sites where the Wi-Fi runs through a contractor's personal hotspot. The cover was dark blue, worn at the corners with a federal seal embossed in faded gold. The spine read, Federal Construction Safety Code, Field Reference Edition. Osei opened it to the front matter, not to the index, not to Appendix 7C, to the opening pages, where the document's authorship and contributing experts were listed in the careful, institutional typography of official government publications. He found the entry he was looking for. He turned the book so it faced Pullen and Cora, and he placed his finger beneath a line of text. Desmond A. Hale, he read aloud, his voice carrying the same level, unhurried tone it had carried since he walked through the site gate. Contributing technical author, Appendix 7C, scaffold loading specifications for elevated pour decks. National Infrastructure Board, Structural Standards Division. The trailer was absolutely still. Cora's eyes moved from the page to Pullen's face and stayed there. Pullen looked at the line of text. He looked at it the way a man looks at a document that is rearranging something fundamental about the last 24 hours, not with guilt exactly, more with the particular, dawning discomfort of someone who has been performing confidence in front of an audience and has just realized the audience knew something he didn't. I wasn't aware of his background, Pullen said. His voice had lost its carrying quality entirely. It was a smaller voice now, contained, working very hard to sound reasonable. That's apparent, Osei said. He closed the book and returned it to his bag. Mr. Pullen, I'm issuing a formal stop work order for the 14th floor scaffold deck pending full remediation of the pin defect identified in Mr. Hale's complaint. The concrete pour scheduled for tomorrow morning will not proceed. Pullen opened his mouth. The order is issued under Section 14, Paragraph 3 of the Federal Construction Safety Code, Osei continued, without raising his voice or altering his pace, which, as you may now appreciate, was co-authored by the man you terminated yesterday for raising this exact concern. He said it without flourish. He didn't need flourish. The sentence carried its own weight. Pullen closed his mouth. Osei turned to Cora. I'll need a copy of Mr. Hale's termination record, the original complaint form with its timestamp, and the site sign and logs for the 48 hours preceding the complaint. He paused. I'll also need the name and contact information for the Caldwell Group's project manager. Cora was already at her filing cabinet. Pullen stood in the center of the trailer looking like a man who had arrived somewhere he didn't intend to go and couldn't identify the moment he'd taken the wrong turn. The bluster was gone, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that air leaves a space when a door is opened, quietly and completely. There's going to be an investigation, Osei said, turning back to him, specifically into the timeline between Mr. Hale's formal safety complaint and his termination. The timestamps are going to be central to that investigation. A pause. 1 hour and 25 minutes, Mr. Pullen. That's the gap between his complaint being filed and his termination being processed. That's a very narrow window. Pullen said nothing. There was nothing left that would help him. Osei made 2 calls from just outside the trailer door, standing in the light rain with his collar turned up. The first was to his regional office, formally logging the stop work order and requesting a second inspector for the remediation assessment. The second call took longer. His voice was lower, more conversational, and from inside the trailer where Cora was pulling files and Pullen was sitting very still in the chair she usually reserved for employees with shift disputes, the words weren't fully audible, but the tone was. It was the tone of a man telling someone something they would want to know. Through the trailer window, the concrete truck could be seen making its turn at the site entrance, slowing for the gate. The driver leaned out and spoke to the gate attendant. The gate attendant made a phone call. The truck idled for 90 seconds, then turned around in the wide apron of the equipment yard and drove back the way it had come. Pullen watched it go through the smudged trailer window. He didn't say anything. He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, and set it back down. Desmond was at the kitchen table with a library book Marcus had left open to a page about deep sea fish when the knock came at his door. It was 11:40. He wasn't expecting anyone. He opened the door to find Raymond Osei standing in the building corridor in a rain-damp coat, his camera bag over one shoulder, and the kind of expression that belongs to a man who has just come from somewhere significant and is still carrying the weight of it. He was shorter than Desmond had imagined from the phone call, compact, deliberate in his stillness, with the watchful eyes of someone accustomed to reading environments rather than decorating them. "Mr. Hale," Osei said. "I apologize for arriving without more notice. I tried calling." Desmond checked his phone. He'd left it on the counter when he'd gone to collect Marcus from school, and he'd been so absorbed in the evening routine, dinner, homework, the small negotiations of bedtime, that he hadn't thought to check it afterward. 3 missed calls. All from the same regional prefix. "Come in," he said. Osei stepped inside and took in the apartment with the quiet, non-intrusive observation of a man who notices things professionally and has learned to do it without making people feel examined. His eyes moved across the whiteboard calendar, the paired shoes, the child's drawing on the fridge, a tall building with a flag on top, still there from yesterday. Marcus appeared in the hallway doorway in his pajamas, drawn by the sound of an unfamiliar voice. "This is my son," Desmond said. "Marcus, this is Mr. Osei. He's a safety inspector." Marcus considered this seriously. "Do you inspect our apartment?" "Buildings," Osei said. "Mostly very tall ones. My dad knows about tall buildings," Marcus said. Osei looked at Desmond. "Yes," he said. "I know." Desmond sent Marcus back to bed with the promise of an explanation in the morning that both of them understood would be partial at best. Then he put the kettle on and sat across from Osei at the kitchen table, the library book pushed to one side. If you've stayed with Desmond this far, through the morning he saw something wrong, through the afternoon they fired him for saying so, then you already understand what this story is really about. Subscribe and hit the bell, because what Osei says next is the moment the whole thing turns. "The stop work order is filed," Osei said. "The pour has been halted. A second inspector will be on site tomorrow morning for the remediation assessment." He paused. "The Caldwell Group's project manager has been notified. They are not pleased with Pullen." "I imagine not," Desmond said. "There will be a formal investigation into the termination. The timestamp on your complaint form and the timestamp on your termination processing are," Osei chose his word carefully, "proximate. The Regional Compliance Office considers that a pattern of concern. Desmond set 2 mugs of tea on the table and sat down. "What do you need from me?" "Your formal statement," Osei said. "Not as a former employee with a grievance, as the subject matter expert whose technical assessment is being used to justify the stop work order." He folded his hands on the table. "Your citation of Appendix 7C in that complaint form, Mr. Hale, the specific paragraph, the load tolerance figures, the shear stress calculation, that's not labor-level documentation. That's expert testimony. The Caldwell Group's legal team is going to challenge the stop work order. They're going to argue it's based on a complaint from an unskilled worker with no technical standing." Desmond wrapped both hands around his mug. "When they do that," Osei continued, "I need to be able to present your credentials. Your authorship of Appendix 7C. Your 14 years at the National Infrastructure Board. Your master's in structural engineering." He paused. "Are you willing to stand behind your assessment officially? On record, with your full background disclosed?" The kitchen was quiet, except for the rain, lighter now, tapping the window with less conviction than it had carried all day. From Marcus's room came the small sounds of a child resettling in sleep. A shift, a murmur, then nothing. Desmond thought about the bracket. About the pour that would have happened at 6 a.m., with 40 men on the floor above it, and the city going about its morning below. He thought about Theo's face when he'd said Danny Marsh had a family. He thought about the complaint form with its timestamp, sitting in Cora's file at the front of the drawer where she'd put it as if she'd known. He thought about Marcus at the table yesterday with paint on his sleeve, drawing a tall building with a flag on top. "Yes," Desmond said. Osei nodded once, not with relief, more with the quiet confirmation of a man who had expected that answer but needed to hear it said. "I'll need your credentials on file by tomorrow morning," he said. "Whatever documentation you have, degree certificates, employment records, your authorship citation from the Infrastructure Board." "I have them," Desmond said. Osei looked at him across the table with something that had moved past professional and into the territory of personal, not intrusive, just honest. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Desmond nodded. "Why the laboring work? With your background, you could be." "I know what I could be," Desmond said. Not sharply, just plainly the way a man states a fact he has already fully reckoned with. He looked at the whiteboard calendar on the fridge, Marcus's schedule in blue, his shifts in black. I needed to be somewhere specific. Osei followed his gaze to the calendar. He was quiet for a moment. "I understand," he said. And from the way he said it, Desmond believed that he did. They agreed at 9 a.m. Osei left at 12:30, with Desmond's credentials photographed, and logged into his compliance tablet. Degree certificates pulled from the drawer where they'd been sitting untouched for 2 years, the National Infrastructure Board employment letter, and a printed copy of the Federal Construction Safety Code front matter with Desmond's authorship citation circled in pen by Osei himself, as if he wanted the physical act of circling it to mean something. Desmond stood at the window after the door closed and watched Osei's car move down the wet street below until the taillights disappeared at the corner. Then he went to check on Marcus, who was deeply asleep with one arm hanging off the mattress in the boneless, total way that children sleep when the world hasn't yet taught them to hold tension in their bodies overnight. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he went to bed. He slept better than he had any right to. In the morning he dropped Marcus at school, exchanged the usual weather commentary with Gerald. The rain had cleared. Gerald predicted sun by noon. Desmond said he'd believe it when he saw it, and took the city bus toward the waterfront. Not the site bus, the city bus, which stopped 2 blocks from the Caldwell Group tower and required him to walk the rest of the way on public pavement, outside the chain-link perimeter, a private citizen approaching a work site where he no longer had a badge. Osei was waiting at the site gate at 8:55. Beside him stood a second inspector, a tall woman named Petra Sans, who carried her own reference binder and had the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who had been doing this long enough to find drama tiresome. She shook Desmond's hand without preamble and said she'd reviewed his credentials that morning. The gate attendant looked at Desmond with the uncertain expression of a man whose instructions hadn't accounted for this particular situation. Osei handed him a temporary access authorization, and that settled it. They rode the hoist to the 14th floor. The crew was on site. The stop work order applied only to the scaffold deck, not the full project, and the upper floors were still active. But word had traveled the way it always travels on construction sites, faster and more completely than any official communication. As the hoist opened onto the 14th floor, the men already there went quiet in the particular way that 30 people go quiet when they understand that what they're about to witness matters. Theo was there. He was standing near the eastern deck section with his arms crossed and his expression calibrated to neutral, but his eyes found Desmond immediately and stayed there. Desmond gave him a single nod. Theo returned it. Then Desmond walked to the North Junction bracket with Osei and Petra Sans, and he stopped being the man who'd been fired off this floor 2 days ago and became something else entirely, not through any announcement or performance, but simply through the act of speaking in his actual voice about the thing he actually knew. He talked them through the assembly. Load distribution across the primary junction. The calculated shear stress at full concrete pour weight given the actual pin diameter versus the specified diameter. The specific paragraph of Appendix 7C that governed the tolerances. The failure probability curve at 18% over tolerance versus 22%. He spoke without notes, without hesitation, with the flat, exact fluency of a man for whom these numbers were not recalled but inhabited. Petra Sans took detailed notes. She asked 4 technical questions, each more specific than the last, and Desmond answered all of them without pausing to think in the way that people pause when they're retrieving information rather than simply expressing it. At one point, she looked up from her binder and said, "You wrote this section." "Most of it," Desmond said. She nodded and went back to her notes. The crew had stopped pretending to work. The men on the 14th floor had arranged themselves in the organic, undirected way that people arrange themselves around something important. Not crowding, not performing attention, just present. Curtis, who never stopped talking, was completely silent. A younger laborer near the hoist had his phone out but wasn't looking at it. Pullen was not on the floor. He had arrived at the site at 8, according to the gate log, and had gone directly to the project manager's meeting that the Caldwell Group had convened in the executive trailer after receiving Osei's formal notification the previous afternoon. From what Cora had told Theo, who had told 2 other men, who had told everyone else, that meeting had not gone smoothly for Pullen. The project manager was a woman named Sandra Keel who had built her reputation on delivery and had very little patience for the kind of problem that arrived with a government stop work order and a timestamp discrepancy in the termination records. On the 14th floor, in the clean morning light that Gerald had correctly predicted, Desmond finished his technical walkthrough and stepped back from the bracket. Petra Sans closed her binder. She looked at Osei. "The complaint assessment is technically sound," she said. "The defect is confirmed. Remediation required before any poor activity." She paused. And the complaint author had more than sufficient technical standing to make this call. Osei looked at Desmond. Around them, 30 men stood in the quiet that follows something being officially, irreversibly set right. Sandra Keel had been in construction project management for 19 years, and she had developed over those 19 years a finely calibrated instinct for the difference between problems that could be managed and problems that had already become something else. The moment Osei's stop work notification had hit her inbox the previous afternoon, she had known with the particular clarity of professional experience that this was the second kind. She was waiting at the bottom of the hoist when it descended from the 14th floor. She was in her early 50s, trim and precise in a sight jacket that fit properly, not the oversized borrowed kind that executives wore on site visits, but one that had clearly been hers for years. She shook Osei's hand, then Petrosant's, then looked at Desmond with the direct, assessing gaze of someone who had already read every document available and was now reconciling them with the person standing in front of her. "Mr. Hale," she said. "Sandra Keel." "Caldwell Group." "I know who you are," Desmond said. Something in her expression shifted, not defensively, more with the recognition of a person who had just confirmed something she'd suspected. "Then you know I have questions." "I'd expect so," he said. They stood to one side of the equipment yard while Osei and Petrosant's moved toward the site office to complete their formal documentation. Around them the site continued its work, the upper floors still active, cranes moving, the city going about its unremarkable Tuesday. The stop scaffold deck 14 floors up was invisible from ground level, which struck Desmond as an accurate metaphor for most of the things that mattered on a construction site. Sandra asked her questions directly and without performance. How long had he known about the defect? Why hadn't he escalated past the foreman level through the developer's own reporting channels? Whether he had any documentation beyond what was already in Cora's file. He answered all of it plainly. She listened with the focused, note-taking attention of someone for whom information was a tool rather than a social currency. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Pullen is being removed from this project," she said, not as an apology, not as a concession, as a statement of operational fact. "Effective this afternoon. The developer cannot carry a foreman who suppressed a documented safety complaint and terminated the complainant within the same working hour." The liability exposure alone, she stopped herself, recalibrated. "That's not what I should lead with to you." "No," Desmond said, "it isn't." She looked at him directly. "I'm sorry for what happened to you on this site." He received that without performing humility or magnanimity. He simply nodded. "Pullen suggested reinstating you," she said, "before the meeting this morning." "I heard. You're not interested?" "No," Desmond said. She nodded slowly, as if she'd expected that too. "Is there anything the Caldwell Group can do that would actually matter to you?" Desmond thought about this genuinely. Not as a negotiating posture, he wasn't performing patience. He was actually thinking about it, the way he thought about structural problems, turning it until the honest answer was visible. "The 30 men who were on that floor when Pullen fired me," he said. "Make sure they know what the complaint was actually about, not through the grapevine, officially. They watched a man get fired for raising a safety concern. They deserve to know that the concern was valid and that the system responded to it." Sandra held his gaze. "I'll have a site communication drafted today. That's all I want," Desmond said. She extended her hand, and he shook it. She walked toward the executive trailer without looking back, which he respected. Cora appeared from the HR trailer as if she'd been watching for the right moment. She walked over to Desmond with her hands in her jacket pockets and stopped a few feet away. "I kept the form at the front of the drawer," she said, "in case anyone came looking." "I noticed," Desmond said. She looked at her shoes for a moment, then back up. "I should have done more yesterday." She stopped. "I filed it, but I should have done more." "You did what you could from where you were standing," he said. "That matters." She nodded, accepting that not as absolution but as something more useful, an honest accounting. Then she went back inside. Theo found him near the site gate 20 minutes later, both of them standing outside the chain-link perimeter on the public pavement where the morning light was doing exactly what Gerald had promised. "Word's going around the floor," Theo said, "about who you are." "I figured it would. Curtis hasn't stopped talking about it." A pause, which is saying something, because Curtis never stops talking about anything. Desmond almost smiled. Theo looked at the tower, its upper floors still active, cranes arcing against the blue, the whole complicated, ambitious, precarious thing rising above the waterfront in the morning light. "You wrote the rules they're supposed to be building by," he said. "And they fired you for quoting them." "Yes," Desmond said. Theo shook his head slowly. Not with anger, though the anger was there underneath it. With the particular, weathered disbelief of a man who has seen enough of the world to know that this is exactly how the world works, and has never quite made his peace with it. "You going to be all right?" Theo said. Desmond looked at the tower for a moment, at the 14th floor, invisible from here, where the bracket was already being assessed for remediation, where the concrete that would have flowed at 6 am was sitting in a truck somewhere on the other side of the city. "Yes," he said. "I think so." They walked to the corner together, Theo and Desmond, and stood at the intersection where the site bus stopped in the mornings. The city moved around them with its usual indifference, a delivery truck double-parked, a woman with a stroller navigating the curb cut, 2 pigeons conducting a territorial dispute over a discarded sandwich wrapper. The ordinary relentless texture of a Tuesday. Theo's bus came first. He picked up his gear bag, paused, and looked at Desmond with the expression of a man who has something to say and is deciding whether saying it serves any purpose. "Danny Marsh," he said finally. "The man Pullen fired 2 weeks ago. For the rebar spacing issue on 9. Desmond waited. He was right too, Theo said, about the rebar. He got on the bus. The doors closed. Desmond watched it pull into traffic and thought about Danny Marsh, whoever he was, standing on the 9th floor with a concern and a job and losing one for raising the other. He thought about how many floors there were between 9 and 14 and how many men there might be between Danny Marsh and the one before him, and the one before that. He walked. Not toward home, not directly. He walked the waterfront route that ran along the harbor edge, past the morning joggers and the dog walkers, and the old man who was always fishing from the same spot on the public pier, regardless of season or apparent success. The tower was visible from here, across the water, its full height legible from this distance in a way it wasn't from directly beneath it. 42 floors of steel and glass and weather sheeting, a crane at its peak turning slowly in the morning air. He looked at it for a long time. There was something he hadn't let himself think about clearly until now. Standing outside the radius of the site and the investigation and the careful professional logistics of the last 24 hours, something that had been sitting at the edge of his attention since Osei had asked, last night at the kitchen table, why the laboring work. He had answered that question honestly. He had needed to be somewhere specific. Specific hours. Specific proximity. The school run in the morning, the pickup in the afternoon, the diner on Clement Street, the whiteboard calendar with the blue marker and the black marker, and the clean, reliable geometry of a life organized around one small person's needs. That was all true. And it had been enough, more than enough, for 2 years. But standing here watching the crane turn at the top of a building whose load tolerances lived in his body like a second language, he felt the edges of something that had been very carefully folded away starting to loosen. He picked up Marcus at 3:20. Marcus came through the school doors without a drawing this time, but with a permission slip for a field trip that needed to be signed by Friday, and a detailed account of a disagreement with a classmate named Oliver that had apparently been definitively resolved in Marcus's favor through the deployment of a particularly effective argument about dinosaurs. Desmond signed the permission slip on the hood of a parked car and listened to the dinosaur argument in full and rendered his verdict, which was that Marcus was correct. They went to the waterfront park instead of the diner. The evening was clear, the rain's work done, the harbor going gold in the late light. Marcus ran ahead to the low stone wall that looked out across the water, climbed up onto it, and stood with his arms out for balance, looking at the city across the harbor. The tower was visible from here too. "Is that your building?" Marcus said, pointing. "Was," Desmond said. "For a little while." Marcus looked at it with the frank, unfiltered assessment of a child who hasn't learned yet to soften his observations. "It's not finished," he said. "No," Desmond agreed. "It isn't." Marcus was quiet for a moment, which was unusual enough that Desmond paid attention to it. "Dad," Marcus said, "do you know how to build things, like actually build them, not just carry stuff?" Desmond sat down on the wall beside him. The harbor light moved on the water below them, and the city hummed its evening hum, and somewhere across the water a crane turned slowly against the darkening sky. "Yes," he said. "Then why aren't you the one in charge of building them?" The question landed with the clean, undeflectable precision of something a child says when they have accidentally asked exactly the right thing. Desmond sat with it for a moment, not deflecting, not performing thoughtfulness, actually sitting with it the way he sat with structural problems until the honest answer became visible. "I'm working on that," he said. Marcus accepted this with a nod and jumped down from the wall and ran toward the playground equipment at the far end of the park, already done with the conversation, already on to the next thing with the blameless velocity of a child for whom the present moment is always more interesting than the one that just passed. Desmond stayed on the wall a little longer. When he got home that evening, he went to the kitchen drawer, the one on the left, below the counter, the one that held the library card and the takeout menus and 2 years of things that didn't have anywhere else to go. He opened it and moved things aside until he found what he was looking for. A business registration form, printed from a government website 14 months ago, folded twice, never submitted. He unfolded it on the kitchen table. He looked at it for a long time without touching it. Then he got up, made Marcus's lunch for tomorrow, and went to say goodnight. 3 weeks passed the way that consequential weeks sometimes pass. Not slowly, not quickly, but with the particular density of time that carries real weight in it. The scaffold remediation was completed in 4 days. The correct load pins were sourced, installed, and certified under Petra Sanz's direct supervision. She sent Desmond a copy of the remediation sign-off by email, which he hadn't asked for, and which told him something about her. The concrete pour happened on a Thursday morning, 6 days behind the original schedule, with the full crew on site and the bracket assembly documented and certified to the millimeter. Nobody was on the 14th floor when it shouldn't have been. The formal investigation into Desmond's termination moved through the compliance office with the methodical, unsentimental momentum of institutional processes that have been given clear timestamps and unambiguous documentation to work with. Cora's original complaint form, date-stamped at 9:50 a.m. The termination processing record, time-stamped at 2:15 p.m. An hour and 25 minutes, exactly as Osai had said. The compliance office didn't need to editorialize about that gap. The gap spoke for itself. Garrett Pullen was removed from the Caldwell Group project on the afternoon of the inspection. He was placed on administrative suspension by his contracting firm, pending the investigation's outcome. The 30 workers who had watched Desmond walk off the floor received a formal written communication from Sandra Keel. As promised, a single-page site notice that described the safety concern, confirmed its technical validity, and stated clearly that the complaint had been filed correctly and acted upon correctly by the compliance system. It said nothing about Desmond by name, which he had expected and didn't mind. What mattered was that the men who had stood there knew. Theo told him that Curtis had read the notice aloud to the entire crew during the morning briefing, which nobody had asked him to do. The National Construction Safety Board sent a letter. It arrived in a standard government envelope with a regional postmark. 3 pages of formal language resolving to a single core acknowledgement. Desmond's complaint had been identified as a model safety intervention, a correctly filed, technically precise, procedurally complete report that had functioned exactly as the safety reporting system was designed to function. The letter recommended the case be used as a training example in the Compliance Office's annual inspector certification program. Desmond read it twice at the kitchen table. Then he opened the cabinet door above the coffee maker, the one he opened every morning when he reached for the filters, and he taped the letter to the inside of the door, not on the wall, not framed. Inside the cabinet, where only he would see it, in the first quiet moment of every morning when the apartment was still and Marcus was still asleep and the day hadn't yet become anything. That felt right. On a Tuesday evening 3 weeks after the inspection, he sat at the kitchen table with the business registration form in front of him and his laptop open beside it. Marcus was in the bath. The sound of water and periodic splashing and a one-sided conversation Marcus was conducting with a toy submarine provided the background. He had looked at the form many times in the past 3 weeks. He had picked up the pen twice and set it down again, not from fear exactly, more from the habit of caution that a person develops when they have arranged their life very carefully around protecting something important and are about to change the arrangement. But Marcus had asked him a question at the waterfront wall, and the question had stayed. He uncapped the pen. In the first field, business name, he wrote, Hale Structural Consulting. 4 words, plain, accurate, his. He filled in the remaining fields with the same steady hand he used for everything, Marcus's permission slips, the whiteboard calendar, the spec sheet he'd carried folded in his vest pocket on a construction site where nobody had known who he was. He signed his name at the bottom. Then he set the pen down and looked at what he'd done. From the bathroom came a small crash, a moment of silence, and then Marcus's voice announcing that the submarine had successfully navigated a difficult obstacle and everyone was fine. Desmond called back that he was glad to hear it. He closed the laptop, he capped the pen. He left the form on the table where he would see it in the morning, after the lunches and the coffee and before the school run, in the window of the day that belonged to him before it belonged to everything else. Then, Marcus appeared in the doorway in his pajamas, damp-haired and carrying the submarine, asking if Dad was coming to bed. Desmond looked at the form one last time. Had his name on it. At the 4 plain words above his name. He pushed back his chair. Yeah, he said. I'm coming. He turned off the kitchen light and followed his son down the hall, and the form sat in the dark on the table where he'd left it, waiting for morning the way that new things wait, with no urgency, no impatience, just the quiet, settled certainty of something that has finally been allowed to begin. Subscribe and don't miss our next story. The billionaire's daughter hired him to clean her office, then she found his name on the building's deed. Trust me, you'll feel it. And tell me in the comments, what injustice should we tackle next? Walk away from that plane and I'll wire you $1 million tonight. The billionaire offered the single dad $1 million to walk away. In front of investors, pilots, and cameras, he treated a grease-stained worker like a problem money could erase. But the single dad didn't argue, beg, or flinch. He answered so calmly the entire terminal seemed to forget how to breathe. Because real worth never needs luxury to prove itself. Before I show you the exact moment when the runway alarms turned that humiliation into the billionaire's worst mistake, Stay with me. By the way, where are you watching from? Tell me in the comments below. The hangar lights glowed against polished marble floors meant for executives, not mechanics. Guests in tailored suits leaned over balcony rails to watch the strange standoff on the runway. A child somewhere behind the crowd asked why the worker wasn't taking the money. The answer was standing in oil-stained boots beneath a jet worth more than most neighborhoods. He looked once toward the cockpit windows where frightened faces pressed against glass. Then he looked back at the billionaire and simply shook his head. The silence stretched tight as a cable ready to snap. Elias Rowan wiped his hands slowly on a rag already dark with grease. He wasn't thinking about money. He was thinking about the warning tone still whining inside the jet's avionics bay, and about the fuel lines trembling under pressure nobody else seemed to notice. Across from him, Adrian Vale stood surrounded by people who never heard the word no. The billionaire's smile tightened as cameras drifted closer. "Listen," he said impatiently, lowering his voice but not his arrogance. "Take the offer, step aside, let professionals handle the situation." A murmur rolled through the guests above. To them it looked generous. To Elias it sounded like someone trying to buy time he didn't have. Another alarm chirped from the aircraft, sharper this time. Several pilots exchanged worried glances. The mechanic tilted his head, listening the way musicians listen for the wrong note in an orchestra. He stepped closer to the landing gear despite security moving nervously beside him. "You really should move back," one guard muttered. Elias barely heard him. A faint vibration shivered through the metal frame under his palm. Wrong rhythm. Wrong system cycle, the kind of pattern he hadn't heard since another runway years ago far from cameras and champagne. Behind him, Vale exhaled loudly, patience evaporating. "Last chance," the billionaire said. $1 million for 10 seconds of common sense." Some guests laughed softly. The mechanic straightened and finally faced him fully. Rain began ticking against the glass walls of the terminal above. Inside the cockpit, a woman pounded once against the window. Fear travels faster than jet fuel when people realize something isn't right. Elias felt that wave moving through the hangar. He also knew exactly what came next if nobody interrupted the chain reaction building inside that aircraft. He thought briefly of his daughter waiting upstairs with a paper cup of hot chocolate. Leela believed her dad fixed things. Not just machines, problems, promises. The mechanic inhaled slowly, smelling fuel, rain, and electrical heat mixing together. Then he looked back toward the billionaire who still expected obedience. "No," Elias said quietly. The word carried farther than anyone expected. Up on the balcony, a conversation died mid-sentence. Vale blinked as if recalculating a deal. But this wasn't a negotiation anymore. Another alarm screamed from the aircraft. This time everyone heard it. Elias turned back toward the jet, already moving. Because $1 million couldn't stop what was about to happen, and he was the only person on that runway who knew it. The mechanic grabbed a maintenance ladder and rolled it toward the aircraft's open service panel. Security shouted behind him, but hesitation weakened their voices. They had just watched a worker refuse a fortune. People don't do that unless they know something others don't. Rain thickened outside, tapping the runway lights like nervous fingers. Inside the aircraft, the frightened passengers were starting to shout. The sound carried through the thin metal skin of the jet. He climbed the ladder 2 steps at a time. Behind him, Vale watched the mechanic reach the avionics hatch. For the first time that night, the billionaire didn't look powerful. He looked uncertain. Because the man he tried to buy was now the only one moving toward the danger, and somewhere above the balcony crowd began to realize the same thing. The quiet single dad they laughed at might be the only person who could save them all, but none of them yet understood why his answer had silenced the room. They were about to. When the panel opened, Everything changed in that instant. The avionics hatch creaked open under Elias's grip, rainwater sliding down the metal panel as he lifted it. Inside the compartment, a maze of cables glowed faintly beneath warning lights blinking in uneven rhythm. The sound he'd heard earlier, the subtle vibration, was louder now, like a heartbeat skipping in a body under stress. Behind him, voices rose across the runway. Hey, you can't just open that." One airport technician shouted. Elias leaned closer, ignoring the panic. His fingers brushed along a cluster of connectors, feeling the temperature through thin rubber gloves. Too hot. Way too hot. From the balcony above, Adrian Vale's irritation had hardened into disbelief. What exactly does he think he's doing? The billionaire demanded. One of the aviation consultants beside him adjusted his glasses nervously. He might be checking the avionics relay, the man muttered. Vale scoffed. A ground mechanic? But the consultant didn't answer. Because the mechanic wasn't moving like someone guessing. He was moving like someone remembering. Below, Elias traced a cable path deeper into the panel. A warning tone pulsed through the aircraft again, shrill, insistent. He muttered under his breath. "Yeah, I hear you." Footsteps approached quickly. 2 airport engineers rushed across the slick runway carrying diagnostic tablets. One of them shouted up to him. "Sir, you need to step down. That system's controlled through the cockpit." Elias glanced over his shoulder. Then why are the cockpit alarms cycling through 3 different failures? The younger engineer froze. What? The mechanic tapped the side of the open panel. Hydraulic pressure alert, then avionics relay, then fuel line imbalance. He paused. That order shouldn't happen unless something upstream is overheating. The 2 engineers exchanged a confused look. From the balcony, Vale folded his arms impatiently. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "Get him off that ladder." Security started toward Elias. But just as they reached him, the jet shuddered. A deep metallic tremor rippled through the fuselage. Inside the cockpit, someone screamed. The engineers looked at each other again, this time pale. One whispered. That shouldn't happen during startup. Elias didn't turn around. Exactly. He reached deeper into the avionics bay, carefully adjusting a relay connection. The trembling eased slightly. Above, murmurs spread across the wealthy guests gathered along the glass railing. They had come for champagne and charity speeches. Instead, they were watching a mechanic stabilize a multi-million-dollar jet. Vale frowned, sensing the shift in the room. He hated shifts he didn't control. "Enough," he said sharply. He grabbed a microphone from the event podium and spoke loudly so everyone could hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the delay. A minor technical issue is being handled." He gestured toward the runway. "Our certified engineers will take over shortly." Down below, the 2 engineers looked up at Elias again. Neither of them moved to climb the ladder, because neither of them understood what he was already diagnosing. Elias studied the blinking lights again. His brow tightened. "Not minor," he murmured. Another vibration passed through the plane. He closed his eyes briefly, listening. A faint memory stirred. A runway at dusk. A jet engine screaming. A warning pattern exactly like this one, back when he wore a different uniform. Back when people didn't look past him. He opened his eyes again. "Hey," he called down to the engineers. "Did anyone check the backup power regulator?" They blinked. "The what?" Elias exhaled slowly. "That explains a lot." Upstairs, Vale leaned toward the consultant again. "What's he talking about?" The man swallowed. "If the backup regulator overheats, it can send conflicting signals through the entire avionics system." Vale frowned. And the cockpit alarms won't know which failure is real The billionaire's confidence faltered for half a second. Below, Elias carefully unclipped a cable bundle. A faint spark snapped inside the panel. The engineers jumped back. Whoa. But the mechanic just nodded. There you are. He tightened the connection and wiped rain from his forehead. The plane's warning tone shifted pitch. For a moment, just a moment, the alarms stopped. Silence rippled through the runway. Passengers inside the cockpit leaned toward the windows in confusion. On the balcony above, people held their breath. Vale stared down at the mechanic. What did he just do? The consultant whispered, stabilized the relay cycle. Vale blinked. But you said only avionics engineers. I did. The billionaire's gaze returned to Elias. For the first time that night, uncertainty flickered behind his confident expression. Because the mechanic he'd tried to buy off was now the only person who seemed to understand the aircraft. Down on the ladder, Elias closed the panel halfway but didn't seal it. The temporary fix wouldn't last. He knew that. And if the engineers couldn't find the overheating regulator soon, the alarms would come back worse. He climbed down from the ladder. Rain dripped from the jet's wings, splashing against the runway lights. The two engineers stepped toward him carefully. How did you know where to look? One asked. Elias shrugged. Pattern recognition. The younger one frowned. You work ground maintenance. Yep, but that kind of diagnosis usually takes. He stopped mid-sentence. Because he realized something. Elias hadn't used a scanner, hadn't checked a tablet. He'd done it by listening. The mechanic glanced up toward the balcony where his daughter stood beside the railing. Leela raised a small fist in quiet encouragement. He smiled faintly. Then he turned back to the jet. All right, Elias said. Now we need to find what's cooking that regulator before it melts. The engineers stared at him. And for the first time that night, they didn't see a mechanic. They saw someone leading the response. And far above them, Adrian Vale realized something even more unsettling. The man he offered $1 million to walk away hadn't even started fixing the real problem yet. Rain slid down the runway lights in long silver lines as the mechanic stepped away from the ladder. The temporary silence inside the aircraft lasted only a few seconds before another warning tone flickered faintly through the metal skin. Not loud yet, but threatening. The two engineers stood beside him, waiting. They didn't even realize they were waiting for instructions. Elias crouched near the aircraft's front landing gear and pressed his palm lightly against the metal housing again. There it was. The vibration hadn't disappeared. It had only slowed. Regulator's still heating, he said quietly. The younger engineer rubbed the back of his neck. But the diagnostics show stable power now. Diagnostics read signals, Elias replied. Heat doesn't always send signals until it's too late. The older engineer squinted at him. How long have you been doing this? Elias shrugged without looking up. Long enough. Up on the balcony, Adrian Vale watched the scene with a tightening jaw. People around him were whispering now. And none of those whispers sounded impressed with him. They said he's just maintenance. I heard he fixed the alarms already. Why would a mechanic know avionics like that? The billionaire hated speculation when it wasn't about his success. He turned sharply toward the consultant beside him. Why are my engineers standing around while that man plays hero? The consultant hesitated. They might be, assessing his findings. Vale's voice dropped lower. I didn't hire them to assess mechanics. Below, Elias stood and wiped rain from his hands again. He walked slowly along the side of the jet, eyes scanning each access panel like a man reading familiar terrain. The engineers followed without realizing they had fallen into step behind him. A few security guards trailed farther back, uncertain what their role even was now. The mechanic stopped beside a smaller hatch near the wing root. He crouched again and listened, not with equipment, with instinct. A faint ticking sound echoed behind the metal, too rhythmic, too steady. He exhaled. "Found you." The younger engineer blinked. "You can hear the regulator from here?" "Not the regulator," Elias said. "The coolant pump that's supposed to keep it from overheating." He tapped the hatch lightly. "It's stalling every few seconds." The older engineer frowned. "That pump should have a failover, exactly." He stood and looked directly at them. "So if the backup didn't kick in..." The younger one's eyes widened. "The system thinks everything's fine, while the regulator cooks itself alive," Elias finished. Above them, the balcony doors slid open. Vale had decided watching from a distance wasn't enough. He strode onto the rain-slick viewing platform surrounded by assistants. The billionaire leaned over the railing. "You." Elias didn't look up immediately. He finished tightening a latch first, then he slowly straightened. Rain dotted his hair. "You talking to me?" Vale's tone sharpened. "Yes." The mechanic, who seems determined to delay this flight. A ripple of uneasy laughter moved through a few guests nearby, but not many. People were starting to sense the stakes. Vale gestured impatiently. "My team tells me you've been interfering with aircraft systems." "Stabilizing," Elias corrected calmly. "Temporary stabilization," Vale scoffed. "Well, congratulations. Now step aside so trained personnel can solve the problem properly." The two engineers exchanged uncomfortable looks. Because they weren't sure they could. Elias glanced toward the cockpit windows. Inside, passengers still looked frightened. One small child was crying. The sound carried faintly through the rain. He looked back up at the billionaire. "Your coolant pump is failing." Vale blinked. "What? If we don't replace or bypass it," Elias continued evenly, "the regulator will overheat again in about 10 minutes. The consultant beside Vale leaned forward quickly. "That actually aligns with the earlier relay spike." Vale stared at him. "You're agreeing with the mechanic now?" "I'm agreeing with the data." Down on the runway, Elias pulled a wrench from the pocket of his work belt. He spun it once in his hand, absent-mindedly. "Pumps behind this panel," he said. "But getting to it means cutting power to 2 systems first." The younger engineer swallowed. "That would shut down the cockpit display for about 30 seconds, Elias said. "Unless someone reroutes auxiliary current manually." The engineer blinked again. "That's a military-level workaround." Elias didn't answer. Up on the balcony, Vale folded his arms. "I'm not authorizing random mechanics to start cutting power to my aircraft." The rain intensified. The jet shuddered again. This time the warning tone returned with a sharper scream. Everyone flinched. The consultant's voice rose nervously. "The regulator temperature is climbing again." Vale's confident posture stiffened. Below, Elias looked back at the panel calmly. Clocks running, the two engineers stared between him and the jet. Because they understood something now. None of them had time to argue about titles. They only had time to fix the plane. And right now the only person who seemed to know exactly how to do that was the man Vale had tried to pay to walk away. Elias knelt beside the hatch and placed the wrench against the bolts. Behind him the runway lights flickered against the rain. Above him the billionaire hesitated. Because if the mechanic was right, the next 10 minutes might decide whether that jet left safely. Or exploded right there on the runway. The alarm returned like a scream tearing through metal. Passengers inside the cockpit jerked back from the windows as the warning lights burst into a frantic strobe again. The jet shuddered harder this time, a deep vibration rolling through the fuselage like thunder trapped under steel. On the balcony above, the consultant grabbed the railing. The regulator temperature just spiked again. Adrian Vale's jaw tightened. Below, Elias didn't look surprised. He tightened his grip on the wrench and began loosening the bolts on the panel covering the coolant system. 1, 2, 3. Rainwater slid down his sleeves as he worked quickly but without panic. The younger engineer crouched beside him. "You're serious about cutting the cockpit power?" "For 30 seconds, Elias said. "That's all the window we need." The engineer glanced toward the jet nervously. "If we miscalculate," Elias met his eyes, "we won't." That confidence didn't sound arrogant, it sounded practiced. Above them, Vale leaned forward again. "You will stop what you're doing immediately," the billionaire barked. Security looked down at the mechanic uncertainly. But the jet shuddered again, louder this time. A long grinding noise echoed from somewhere deep inside the aircraft. Passengers began shouting. The older engineer looked up toward the balcony. "Sir, if the coolant pump fails completely, the regulator could overload." Vale snapped. "I understand the risk." "No," the engineer said quietly. "You understand the price of the plane." Silence fell for a split second. Vale's expression darkened. Below, Elias pulled the panel loose. Steam hissed faintly from inside the compartment. The younger engineer recoiled. "That's overheating already." "Exactly," Elias said. Inside the cavity, the coolant pump vibrated violently against its mounting bracket, jerking every few seconds like a heart struggling to beat. The mechanic studied it for a moment. Then he sighed. "Pump's dying. Can we replace it?" The younger engineer asked quickly. Elias shook his head. "No spare on site." The man's face went pale. "Then what do we?" "We bypass it." The engineer blinked. "With what?" Elias reached into his tool belt again. He pulled out a short braided hose and a pair of pressure clamps. The younger engineer stared. "You carry coolant bypass equipment in a maintenance belt?" Elias shrugged. "Old habit." Up on the balcony, the consultant whispered urgently to Vale. If he reroutes the coolant flow manually, it might hold long enough to stabilize the regulator. Vale rubbed his temples. "This is absurd." But the alarms screamed again. And this time the plane's left engine coughed violently. Passengers inside the cockpit lurched sideways. The sound of panic spread across the runway. The billionaire looked down at the mechanic again. For the first time that night, he didn't see a stubborn employee. He saw the only person moving toward the problem while everyone else debated it. Below, Elias slid the bypass hose into place with precise movements. Rain soaked the back of his shirt. The engineers watched him work with growing amazement. "You've done this before," the older one murmured. Elias tightened the final clamp. "Something like it." The younger engineer hesitated. "Where?" For a brief moment, Elias didn't answer, because the sound of that failing pump had pulled a memory from somewhere deep in his mind. A desert runway, an aircraft bleeding fuel, a countdown shouted over military radios. He pushed the memory away and focused on the present. "Doesn't matter," he said quietly. He reached toward the wiring harness above the pump. "Now we cut cockpit power for 30 seconds. The younger engineer swallowed hard. "That's a big risk." Elias glanced toward the cockpit window. Inside, frightened faces looked back, including a woman clutching the armrest with white knuckles. Someone important. Someone Vale cared about. The mechanic looked back at the engineer. "The bigger risk is doing nothing." Up on the balcony, Vale's voice cracked across the runway again. "If you shut down that cockpit display, I will personally have you removed from this airport." Elias finally looked up. Rain streaked across his face. "Then you might want to start removing people now," he said calmly. "Because the regulator hits meltdown in 8 minutes." The consultant gasped quietly beside Vale. 8? The billionaire stared down at the mechanic. The man didn't look afraid. Didn't look impressed, didn't even look angry. He just looked certain. Below, Elias reached for the manual override switch. The younger engineer's voice trembled. 30 seconds exactly? 30, then we bring auxiliary current online? Elias nodded. You're learning. The engineer inhaled sharply. Above them, Adrian Vale finally realized something terrifying. The mechanic he'd tried to pay to walk away wasn't improvising. He was executing a plan. A plan that sounded disturbingly familiar to the consultant beside him. The man leaned closer to Vale and whispered, "That bypass method, it's used in military emergency procedures." Vale blinked. Military? The consultant nodded slowly. Yes, below, Elias's hand hovered over the override switch. The rain fell harder. Passengers inside the jet watched through the windows, and the billionaire realized something he had never expected to feel. He wasn't in control anymore. The mechanic was. And if the man was wrong, everyone on that runway would know it in 30 seconds. The alarm returned like a scream tearing through metal. Passengers inside the cockpit jerked back from the windows as the warning lights burst into a frantic strobe again. The jet shuddered harder this time, a deep vibration rolling through the fuselage like thunder trapped under steel. On the balcony above, the consultant grabbed the railing. The regulator temperature just spiked again. Adrian Vale's jaw tightened. Below, Elias didn't look surprised. He tightened his grip on the wrench and began loosening the bolts on the panel covering the coolant system. 1, 2, 3. Rainwater slid down his sleeves as he worked quickly but without panic. The younger engineer crouched beside him. "You're serious about cutting the cockpit power?" "For 30 seconds, Elias said. "That's all the window we need." The engineer glanced toward the jet nervously. "If we miscalculate," Elias met his eyes. "We won't." That confidence didn't sound arrogant. It sounded practiced. Above them, Vale leaned forward again. "You will stop what you're doing immediately," the billionaire barked. Security looked down at the mechanic uncertainly. But the jet shuddered again, louder this time. A long grinding noise echoed from somewhere deep inside the aircraft. Passengers began shouting. The older engineer looked up toward the balcony. "Sir, if the coolant pump fails completely, the regulator could overload." Vale snapped. "I understand the risk." "No," the engineer said quietly. "You understand the price of the plane." Silence fell for a split second. Vale's expression darkened. Below, Elias pulled the panel loose. Steam hissed faintly from inside the compartment. The younger engineer recoiled. "That's overheating already." "Exactly," Elias said. Inside the cavity, the coolant pump vibrated violently against its mounting bracket, jerking every few seconds like a heart struggling to beat. The mechanic studied it for a moment. Then he sighed. "Pump's dying. Can we replace it?" The younger engineer asked quickly. Elias shook his head. No spare on sight, the man's face went pale. "Then what do we? We bypass it." The engineer blinked. "With what?" Elias reached into his tool belt again. He pulled out a short braided hose and a pair of pressure clamps. The younger engineer stared. "You carry coolant bypass equipment in a maintenance belt?" Elias shrugged. "Old habit." Up on the balcony, the consultant whispered urgently to Vale. If he reroutes the coolant flow manually, it might hold long enough to stabilize the regulator. Vale rubbed his temples. "This is absurd." But the alarm screamed again, and this time the plane's left engine coughed violently. Passengers inside the cockpit lurched sideways.